Okay, it says that we're live, so I'll just assume that we are. If anyone in the chat channel just confirm it, that'd be good. So today we will be joined. Well, today we're joined by a returning guest, my friend Zachary. So Zachary, Zach, if you want to just like give a brief introduction to who you are, and then we can take it from there, and also what we'll be doing today.
Yeah, so I'm Zach Wright, as in I try not to be Zach wrong. That's how I introduced to myself to my Sunday school class. But yeah, I volunteer with FAIR. I'm a returned missionary, but I've known Robert and a lot of friends of his show for a while. Examples are including but not limited to Jennifer Roach. Travis has been on here a couple times, which has been good. And I've tried my best to kind of engage in a lot of this apologetic work because from my view, I find it's really interesting. And I think it leads to a lot more of a fulfilling faith. And today's topic is very near and dear to my heart because I've actually been familiar with today's topic for a long time. So today we are going to be going over the Gospel for Mormons.
Well, in the show notes, my response to this reviewing Jeff Durban on Mormonism, which he has never actually really responded to, is in the show notes, as is the fair episode responding to it as well. So,
Right. And that's important to bring up too. So they came out with the Gospel for Mormons quasi a decade ago. It's been around for a while,
yeah, it's a pretty
but
popular video.
yeah. And shortly thereafter, you wrote your I would say very detailed, very quite comprehensive rebuttal that to that.
Yeah.
And I I would sometimes refer people to that, but they would take one look at it and go like, Clement who? And sometimes they had a hard time being able to get over like the long paragraphs. And so what I wanted to do in conjunction with my work at Fair is I wanted to create kind of a diet version of that, so to speak, because granted, I have not done I don't have the theological expertise I think you have, Robert. I can hold my own, I think, but
Yeah, you
today
you
we're
recently you recently destroyed Aaron Schaff, so that's always a good to do.
I
The most
that was
autistic Calvinist on the internet, but yeah.
it was not a great conversation, and I'm sure I just had to walk away from it because I only have so much patience and time for those kinds of discussions, and I think that what I was able to learn about Aaron was enough for me in that conversation. And so we'll have to see if we'll have to see if I meet him again. Like I've talked to him multiple times, but he with Aaron, it's a little tricky to talk with him because he doesn't fully engage with you, if that makes sense. It's there's he only
Personally, I
focuses
think
on
it's a mix
things.
between autism and just being disingenuous, but that's just me.
I can't speak to motive, but unfortunately I'm there's not a lot of good ways for me to reconcile how he behaves. That's my only concern. And I feel like it's difficult to have a good conversation with him because of how he interacts with people, where he'll record people and he'll try and bait people. Like I've talked to him alongside the God Loves Mormon people. I'm trying to blank on
Yeah,
what his name is, Bradley, I think, something like that.
yeah.
And they've outrightly told me that when they go out, they try and trap people. And I've got like the record stuff. I've got like a recording of that to prove it. And so they have no they quickly lose my respect when from my view they try to focus more on winning than they try to focus on having a good conversation, meeting people where they're at, finding common
And by the
ground.
way, speaking for the God Loves Mormons group, a couple of years ago, I did offer a open debate challenge on sola scriptura and salvation, and still open to do it, but we'll see if Bradley et al. Will ever do it. I even offered to debate Bill McKeever on a two versus one type of debate. But before we're going to do that, like someone did actually ask a person, um, what did everyone think of the Jacob Isabel versus Jacob Hansen debate? I'm not sure if you caught that yesterday on whether Joseph was a polygamist.
I didn't see it,
Okay.
admittedly. I was wrapped up doing other things in preparation for this
Yeah.
podcast, and so I didn't get the chance to look at it. I know it's Word Radio recorded it and they did
Yeah.
a live stream of it.
Yeah.
And I think Jacob's like posted another follow-up on his own channel as well, but I didn't get the chance to see it. But the short
Well,
answer is I assume that Jacob Hansen was able to
yeah.
demonstrate.
Jacob Jacob Hansen, I thought, won the debate. I mean, he presented a lot of the historical information, and Isabel engaged in semantic obfuscation. That's all I can say. But yeah, also like there's a very good book. Well, it's a mixed bag, but like there's a good book, Secret Covenants: New Insights on Early Mormon Polygamy, published by Signature. There's two essays by Don Bradley, one of them co-authored with Christopher Smith on Fanny Alger, and they're absolute game changers. I think they do a very good job at showing the marriage you're seeing took place after the reception of Section 110. But there's also an essay by Mark Tensmeyer, which is a very detailed refutation of the idea that Joseph was always a monogamist. But yeah, that's because that's not the topic of discussion. We'll just kind of briefly discuss that there. But yeah, Svensson says Isabel's argument was an appeal to emotion with no facts. Hansen shared facts. Hansen won. Yeah, I agree. So, and Peyton says, I was told directly by Church Apologia guy in Mesa that they specifically and purposely move into member-heavy neighborhoods to hand out their propaganda. I'm not surprised, especially when you have someone like James White and Jeff Durbin at the F4. But yeah, so we'll be coming through their video, the Gospel of the Mormons. I will want to tear out my hair, but let's kind of get to it. You should be able to share your screen. So
All right,
whatever you want to discuss, we'll do that.
Yeah, give me just a second here.
Go ahead.
There we go. You should be able to see it, right?
Unfortunately.
So I have about it's about 35 minutes of content. We should just be able to go straight through, but we'll pause when I think it's necessary, and I'll stop sharing, and we'll say a couple of things in between each clip. A lot of these first clips are a little bit shorter. There are a couple that I would like to be able to get to for sure towards the end, because I think they've tried to save the best stuff for last. But what you'll notice, and I hope that your viewers will be able to pick up on this too, is that throughout the majority of their discussion, they don't actually address very much of the article at all. And that was kind of surprising to me. What they try to focus on is first off, they do character assassination against you.
Yeah.
And second off, they criticize the way that you go about compiling sources, first and foremost. And they say that you're being inconsistent in that regard. We'll, of course, talk about that today. I don't think that there's any consistency to be found. But I think this first clip is a good example
of... And before you kind of do this, it's like James White has not, and this is the same not just for Mormonism, but also his engagement with Roman Catholicism as well. He has not updated these arguments since the 90s. He has not engaged meaningfully with, say, the works of Blake Hoster, myself, Jerry Grover, Stephen Smoot on the Book of Abraham. And when it comes to Catholicism, he's decades behind the literature when it comes to, say, the history of justification, ecclesiology, and even Mariology. I mean, he's worked on the bodily assumption and dormition of Mary is like abysmally bad. He seems to be familiar with Shoemaker's book, but I don't think he's read it. So, and for White, Dan, and especially now, it's all about stories. Like he opens up this response to me by just kind of going down the same tired story he brings up, like say how, he met his first elders Reed and Reese in the 80s, and the only stuff he's read by up to then was something by Walter Merton, blah, blah, blah. It's the same story over and over and over. He correctly argues, like, say, a lot of Romanists engage in storytelling when it comes to, say, why they left Protestantism and so forth. This is very similar as well. There's no meaningful engagement. And I really doubt he's read anything by, say, Blake Oster. And he kind of critiques like how lengthy my response was, but my dude, the video was pretty lengthy as well. And you're talking about someone who wrote an entire book, critiquing a book on Calvinism a few years ago. Norman Geisler's Shows About Free. James Wright wrote an entire book just responding to that called The Potter's Freedom. So, he has no right to bitch about like the length of response and stuff like that.
Unfortunately, with a lot of claims like this, the responses are naturally going to be longer than the actual content themselves, because it takes far less effort, as we'll see today, to posit an argument than it is to refute an argument.
Yeah, well, that's kind of gets into this crap show. So,
all right, let's get started. Yeah. Why is it not working? There we are.
I can't hear the audio.
Uh-oh.
When you're sharing the screen, there should be like an option to be able to share the audio.
Hold on, I'm sorry. I should have done this better. Hold on. I'll stop and I'll try again. That should solve the problem. I'm supposed to. Yeah, it's all right. Okay. Better?
I can't hear it still.
Well, that's hurting my feelings. Hold on.
When you're sharing the screen, maybe if you like to click it out, and there should be a little box saying share the audio or something to that.
Hold on. Share sound. There we are.
I think, because
Yes.
there's lots of great books on Mormonism, and people ask me sometimes, they say, "Are you ever going to write a book on Mormonism?" My answer is no. There's too much great stuff out there. I don't think there's any reason to do any more. What we need now is Christians to go out on the mission field and
Use what's out there. Yeah.
That's right. But I think that there's books out there with great information on Mormonism, the history. One Nation Under God's Richard Abanis is fantastic as an overview of some of the history.
Mormonism, Shadow Reality, of course, is the
That's right.
grandfather of them all.
Yeah, and then you have so Gerald and Sandra Tanner's ministry has put out a lot of detailed information on Mormonism and its history, and there's compare and contrast. But Letters to a Mormon Elder, I think, is important for Christians because these are imaginary conversations, but
Right.
they are based upon conversations that you've had with Mormons over the years, hundreds.
And they represented really a little bit more of the traditional Mormon belief. I suppose if I were to do it today, I'd have to include some letters to some missionary who had become the subjectivist that we now deal with all the time, where you've got your truth, I've got my truth. It's a lot easier to deal with the old-time Mormons who would say, hey, there's the church of the Lamb, the church of the devil, and there but save two churches, and go to Joseph Smith's testimony, and hey, God the Father, God, Jesus Christ, they appeared. Those churches are false. This is the one true church. It's easier to deal with someone like that.
That's right.
Than what you're dealing with today.
Yes, and that is the difficult thing today is oftentimes you have to convert someone to Mormonism to get them
Out of Mormonism. Yeah, that's true.
So, and that's, early on, a lot of the engagements, they would actually tell me, no, you're not Christian. We are.
Right.
The true church. They would call us Gentiles. Things like that.
Mormons used to be significantly more theologically minded than they are today. Today, there is so much more of a subjective, emotional mindset than there was back in the 80s. That it really has changed well, as you pointed out, you almost have to trip Mormons to get them into conversations today.
Yeah.
Whereas the first time we ever went to the General Conference of Mormon Church in Salt Lake, we had a line of people waiting to talk to us.
Yeah.
By the end of the day, we were hoarse because there was no breaks.
Yeah.
It was just constant the whole time. But I saw over the decades that decreasing and decreasing. And it just reflected the change that I have seen in Mormonism, which is now causing them tremendous difficulties.
All right, so we'll pause and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I wanted to share that specific clip because there were several things that I noticed that first off I just wanted to point out. So again, they automatically infer an inherent dichotomy between Christianity proper and us. They are walking into this with the presupposition that we as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are not Christians by any stretch of the margin. And their appeal, it's a classic no true Scotsman, and we'll see a few fallacies committed by these two tonight as they address or attempt to address your comments here. But I would love for them to be able to show what it really means to be a Christian proper, because they never really address that here. And they, alongside many other Protestants or just general Christians who talk to us about this sort of thing, they never really show what they mean, and they can't really provide a very consistent message as to what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah, and if you look at like how
yeah.
Christianos is used in the Greek New Testament, it's never given a theological definition beyond someone who follows Christ. And if you look at, say, the Protestant debates as to like what constitutes a primary or a primary doctrine that you must at least not knowingly reject. They'll say maybe like Nicene, Chalcedonian, Trinitarianism, some type of vicarious atonement theory, and a couple of other things like forensic justification, the belief that one's ground of justification is through the forensic imputation of Christ's righteousness and so forth. But like the Bible does not really actually, I would argue, does not teach these things. And if you look at history, and perhaps we'll be discussing some of their arguments of the apostasy, that's not the case as well. I mean, when you look at, say, justification, just read Alistair McGrath's book, Justitia Dei, especially in the most recent edition, where he admits Augustine was not the lone figure who taught transformative justification. That's also in the Greek fathers. Those are other things as well. So yeah, they don't really provide a definition. I mean, I've been following Wright for like about 20 years, and I've read like maybe 18, 20 of his books. So I'm familiar with his theology. Most of the rare LDS he's read, like, say, Charles Hodge and Francis Turretin, who he's fond of as well. So I'm kind of familiar with like his MO. But also the books they recommended were pretty awful. I mean, Richard
Right?
this book, I actually have it on my desk here, One Nation Under Gods. It's crap. I think Fair has actually a pretty good review of that book on their Wikipedia page. There's also been very good reviews of it. Shadow Reality, that was the first book I read after my baptism 19 years ago, so I'm very familiar with it. I mean, they do bring up some good points here and there, but like anyone who's familiar with the primary sources, and this is what I work for professionally at the moment, they're way dated. I'm sorry, but this kind of shows like where's the interaction with, like, say, some of the better stuff. I'd love to know what Wright's assessment is of, say, the New Mormon Challenge from 2002 or some of the better stuff, comparatively speaking, which is better than anything he's been able to produce. And again, we kind of say this like if you study his work, he does not interact like the best in the last 20 plus years.
Not particularly. At least that's what I found. Like I watch their videos and I consistently find myself disappointed by how they approach members of the church and their rhetorical tricks and their appeals to emotion, and it's just not super great.
By the way, speaking of subjectivism, I'm going to read one or two things, and I want you to tell you, like, is this following from a Latter-day Saint or not? Our
Okay.
full persuasion and assurance of the truth of Scripture is from the inward work of the Holy Spirit, bearing witness by and with the word in our hearts, and also because neither do we think that therefore the outward religion is to be taught as fruitless, because the instruction in true religion depends on the inward illumination of the Spirit. That's basically two quotations from two sources. So, is it a source from like LDS or is it someone else?
I would say it was someone else, but only because they mentioned Holy Spirit instead of Holy Ghost. And the vernacular nowadays is more you're more common to hear Holy Ghost.
Yeah, and that is from the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 1 on the Holy Scripture, and also the 1566 Second Helvetic Confession. Basically, if you look at, like, say, the history of Protestantism, White's a presuppositionist, but if you were to ask even a presuppositionist how they know that they know, it's like my inward indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So like that's subjectivism, quote unquote, as well. So we're actually on the same level. But because of his piss poor ecclesiology, we do have like a normative authority after the apostolic era that can actually definitively answer these issues. He doesn't, but we'll probably get into that later. But yeah, it's not really a good start so far.
Yeah, it's not. And I don't think it gets better from my point of view, but we'll keep going.
Yeah, and I do, before you do, like Peyton Brown in the comments said, White seems to want to stay in the 80s and he's using cultural emotional Mormonism as an excuse to avoid harder and newer scholarship. That's true.
Yeah. All right, we'll keep going though.
Yeah.
This will be a good one, actually.
Actually, something that's brought up in this article here in the opening comments. He says that Durban claims that Latter-day Saints he engages with claims that the LDS Church to be just another denomination. However, any informed Latter-day Saint, I do wonder if Durban would ever debate someone of the caliber of Blake Ostler or Daniel Peterson, then target...
By the way, we've had a standing challenge to Daniel Peterson for about 15, 20 years.
I was going to ask you about that.
He won't debate.
Yeah.
I'll debate you, James.
All right, yeah, so there's that. But correct me if I'm wrong here, Robert, but didn't James White do a debate with Dan Peterson like a
In
couple decades
1993
ago?
or 1994, they had a radio debate with on Martin Tanner's channel. It's actually on YouTube, and Dan and Bill Hamblin mopped the floor with James White. Even if you're like a Calvinist and you're a fan of James White, listen to it and try to be as unbiased as possible. White embarrassed himself.
I remember watching or at least listening to the first few clips of that. They're on YouTube. Anyone can find them.
I think
And
they're on the Fair YouTube channel as well. I remember sharing the MP3s with Tyler Livingston while he was still a member of the church and with Fair. But yeah.
Yeah, so they're out there. You can take a look. But I remember listening to it and feeling rather disappointed with James White and how he was bouncing around and he was avoiding questions. I didn't like it very much. But I also think it's telling that it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where they kind of talk about the sort of thing as if their point of view is like settled and there's no other way to look at it besides Mormonism is a cult, ergo false, that sort of thing. But if you really go back and if you're looking at the modern scholarship, because we learn and we gain additional insight about the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon, in my view, gets better and better and looks better and better over time. I don't see them engaging with that very often.
Yeah, I've never seen James White interact with meaningfully with John Sorensen, except the thing like, well, he claims mechanas are swords, but they're actually clubs. Although Ron Hassick and other non-LDS Mionists and Aztecans will actually call it a sword or a broadsword. Or has he ever engaged with, say, Warren Aston or any others in, say, the Old World Geography of the Book of Mormon, or meaningfully interact with Tretnas at all in the Asian or Eastern background? And speaking of Blake Oster, he's working the Throne Theophany in 1 Nephi 1 in light of modern scholarship. No, nothing there. I mean, if you read Letters to a Mormon Elder, and I think it's on archive.org now, it's piss poor.
I've read it. I actually read that on my mission and a little bit after it, just so I could I didn't just so I could kind of see the kind of claims in there. I don't think I could force myself to get all the way through it because I remember reading and thinking, wait, these are the arguments he's bringing up, and these are the answers to said argument. Oh, okay.
He's basically really reliant upon Wesley Walters and the Tanners when it comes to like most of his stuff against Mormon history and scripture, especially the Book of Abraham. I doubt he's even read anything by Guy meaningfully or Kerry Multistein or Stephen Smoot on the Book of Abraham.
So we'll get to that here in a second, but they kind of we'll see here in this next clip. They try and talk about how allegedly the church is backing away from their claim that we are the true and living church, and we'll see that here, and then we'll kind of discuss that a little bit because I think it's worth addressing.
Then targeting unexpecting Latter-day Saints as he is wont to do. He says he wonders if he will know that Mormonism does not claim to be just another denomination within the broad Christian spectrum. It is the only true church therein. I was actually encouraged to see him say that.
Oh yeah, this definitely represents the old style farms type of material that back in the old BBS days, before the internet. Yes, before the internet. These are the kinds of Mormons that, they're believing Mormons, and believing Mormons are still out there. They, however, are in the same position that conservative believing Roman Catholics are today, in that they're realizing their leadership is not really with them anymore. They can look back they can read Bruce R. McConkie, they can read these guys and go, that's where I am. But as I listen to the leadership today, I've been left behind. Mm-hmm. And it really does, I think as I read this article, it seemed very shrill to me. And I think a lot of that comes from, I think, a sense of desperation on their part to realize that what they were brought up believing really isn't what is being taught by the leadership of the church anymore.
Right.
They're becoming a minority. And that would be a frightening thing to be facing.
Absolutely.
Robert, you can't just laugh. You can't laugh because I'll laugh if I see you.
Because I'm Irish, I just want to curse at the moment, but I won't. But what other bullcrap?
So there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah,
admittedly.
I'll let you start.
So first off, let me read. We'll turn the tables on you for a second, and So this is something. This is an address given by William Grant Bangerter. I have it pulled up on my phone here, and I want you to guess when this was written. Kind of talk a little bit about how the church has tried to maintain kind of a nuanced view of how we view other churches, and in relation to us being the quote unquote true and living church. So we'll say. Here it is. It's as I have pondered the same question, I wonder, do we believe that all ministers of other churches are corrupt? Of course not. Joseph Smith certainly did not intend that. By reading the passage carefully, we find that the Lord Jesus Christ was referring to those ministers who were quarreling and arguing about which church was true, that is, the particular group with which Joseph Smith was involved. So that's kind of interesting. Can you give a rough estimate? When do you think that was said?
I know some people will say like it's a modern era, but I'm just going to say like sometime in the early 1900s.
That's 1985.
Okay.
And so this is hypothetically when James White is in his prime and is trying to deal with all of this sort of thing. And
he started witnessing the Mormons in about 82 or 83.
Right. And so this is something that's being said quite early. And granted, I'll concede, like when you find someone on the street, you can't expect them to have a comprehensive knowledge of their history. It would be the equivalent of, me waiting outside like a Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses or outside like a Pentecostal church and saying, "Hey, have you ever heard of Bart Ehrman?" No, and we don't want to do that. We don't do that sort of thing. But us trying to understand our Christian brothers and sisters has always been a hallmark, and I think there are several quotes wherein we can appeal to stuff that Joseph Smith has said and what other leaders have said. Gordon B. Hinckley, I know, has a quote or two on this sort of thing, where we don't view as everyone outside of the church as inherently evil. That's not what we do.
We don't have the same anthropology, and James White should know this as total depravity. The idea, like, although we're not as evil as we could be because God's restrained us, there's nothing inherently morally good with any one of us, Christ accepted, since the fall. So there's like an anthropological aspect to this as well that LDS and Reformed Baptists like him would disagree with.
Right. And we don't hold that same worldview he does. We don't look at the world as being an inherently fallen place per se. Not the same way they do, I would argue. And their attempt of like absolutizing this kind of phrases is like the real Mormons believe this sort of thing, that everyone else outside of the church are Gentiles and of the church of the devil, that sort of thing. That's, again, they're doing the no true Scotsman fallacy thing when they talk about that, or like the only people I want to talk to are those sorts of people. And it bothers me a little bit because I don't want my worldview to be misrepresented. And that's one of the whole reasons I got into this whole gig in the first place. There is a balance. I mean, I can, if you squint, you can kind of see where he's coming from. Wherein on one hand, we claim that we are Christians in the sense that we accept Jesus Christ as our Savior, and we want to follow his teachings, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, he's not entirely wrong when he says that our conceptualization of Jesus is different than his because we reject we reject creedal Christianity in that sense. So we don't believe in the consubstantial Trinity. And so if you want to get into conversations like that, that's far and away from his implication that, we are divorcing ourselves from Christianity. That's a different discussion to have. And we absolutely do believe things that set us apart and I would argue, help qualify us in our assertion that we are unique and that we would say that we are true and living in the sense we believe in priesthood authority. We believe in covenants that are manifested by that authority. One need only look at things like the Restoration Proclamation or conference talks given over the past several decades about covenants and priesthood and that sort of thing.
He also tries to draw a parallel between the modern exions of the modern LDS Church and that of modern Rome. But
well, you haven't done any study on that, Robert.
No. Just well read in, say, Mariology and the Mass and ecclesiology, but they're basically being overrun by modernists, like the whole school of cardinals, or the college of cardinals, I should say, are like more or less like liberals, universalists, and modernists to almost to a man. I mean, Ratzinger had to fight after Watola or JP II died in 2005 to be elected as pontiff. But you kind of see this with Francis, where it's very left leaning. And I don't see any meaningful evidence of, say, the Quorum of the 12 or the First Presidency or modernists. I mean, they may be a bit more friendly towards, like, say, non-LDS groups, but at the same time, they are pretty conservative when it comes to morality and very conservative when it comes to the unique true claims of the church. I'm sure if we were to poll them, they would all agree that the Book of Mormon is a historical translation, that, literally God and Jesus appeared in Joseph Smith in 1820. It's not metaphorical and so forth. But if you were to poll the College of Cardinals in Rome today, I'm sure, and I say this as someone who has like very traditional Catholic family and friends, especially back home in Ireland, of all places, they would hesitantly agree, like, the majority would probably give answers that would make the Council Fathers of Vatican I or the Council of Trent blush before they would be, condemned as heretics.
It's a false comparison.
It is.
And I can definitely get behind that. It's important that when we make analogies like that, we're careful about the context in which we're comparing.
Yeah, and also to try to dismiss my article as being shrill and stuff like that, that's just friggin' pathetic. And I wasn't raised LDS, so James obviously did not even try to find out anything about me as well. Because if he did, he would have known, like, I've done extensive studies professionally in theology, and I can read Greek and Hebrew. They claim I can't, but STFU, James.
We'll get to that here in a couple of these other clips, because they do make some claims about that. But we'll go ahead and jump over to the next clip here. Let's see. Do I want this one? Yeah, no, this is good. This is good.
By the way, for those listening, I don't know what the order of clips is. So I've watched this years before, but I don't know exactly what he's sharing with me. So this is kind of...
No, I try to stay in chronological order.
Yeah, but still, I don't know what exactly you want to discuss.
Is that the right? It's fine. Yeah.
But he says in the article, and one of the reasons why I thought it'd be good for us to do this together, he says, this article will be a response to some of Durban's misinformed, quote, arguments. As a background, Durban is a Reformed Protestant and is buddies with James Wright. Such alone explains his multitudinous theological errors and inability to engage in exegesis.
Oh, yes, yes.
Instead, he just throws out a text and hopes that his audience will accept what he says about it, hook, line, and sinker.
The irony is, to be perfectly honest with you, with all due respect, as I read through this, the article is internet scholarship. And what I mean by internet scholarship, it's when someone takes disconnected sources that are actually not consistent with one another, if you actually know the backgrounds, and you pull long citations and throw them all together, not even bothering to create transitionary statements that actually connect these things together in any meaningful fashion, but just simply an attempt to demonstrate, well, look at what I've found and look at the argument I can make here. And it's really difficult to follow. It wanders all over the planet. A good editor would have gotten rid of about 87% of it as being utterly irrelevant, no foundation offered, not relevant to the thesis, so on and so forth. And so the actuality is the lack of exegesis is actually on the part of Mr. Boylan, not the other way around. So it's a projection thing.
Right.
He doesn't do exegesis because, well, I actually know I can't, so I'm going to say somebody else can.
So that's just well poisoning.
Yeah,
there was not a.
By the way, he does this all the time. He does this with Robert Sungenis as well. For those who don't know, Sungenis is a Catholic apologist, and he has destroyed White in debate on multitudinous occasions. For instance, he's written like a 775-page book called Not by Faith Alone. And James White rarely has ever interacted with it, except just a bitch, like, well, if you had an editor, it would be like whittled down 50%. And also, evidence of it being wordy and without foundation. I mean, he's accusing me of engaging in projection. I'm saying he's accusing, that's itself is a projection. And it doesn't get any better for White or Durban. Again, I would say people look at the exegesis. I quote non-LDS scholars in context. And yeah, it can be pretty dense because one, we're dealing with theology, and two, I think it's pretty well known English is my second language. But at the same time, this is really embarrassing for James.
Hmm. No, I looked at this and I remember watching this for the first time and thinking to myself, he's got to be kidding. Like,
Yeah, or like as someone in the comments said, did he just admit he doesn't understand your citations? Yeah, it's basically like just laziness. And by the way, James, if you ever listen to this, which one of your books was actually peer reviewed by non-Protestant scholars? You know, was The God Who Justified actually peer reviewed by, say, Jesuit scholars or anyone outside your little circle from Harvest House or Hull Publishing or Bethany Books? Same when it comes to your book, Letters to a Mormon Elder. Pray tell, who were the peer reviewers for that? You know, or is it just like internet scholarship in the you know, as well? So you know, we can both engage this kind of game. So.
It's not a smart game to play.
And no, because you'll get. I'm Irish. I will verbally destroy him, and I know he's part Scottish, but come on.
Or let's even look at this. I can point to examples where I've discussed things with you, and you are very quick to say, "Hey, this is a complex issue. It's important to look at the different perspectives, and there are different things." I remember talking with you about what was 2 Kings 3, and the variety of views that's been taken, and how even though there's a consensus about what's going on there in terms of how the ancient Israelites believed in the concept of other gods. We'll get a little bit more into that today as well. But I remember I remember admiring you a lot in that regard, just saying, hey, I try to keep a variety of different sources on hand, and you post them on your blog as kind of being a repository of this is what conservative scholars say, this is what more liberal scholars say. And the fact that he doesn't recognize that indicates he hasn't read your stuff, and he doesn't know who you are as a person.
No, and
that bothers me.
Yeah, and also it's not me bragging. It's like I'm making next to Bray Coster. I'm actually the most well-read LDS apologist when it comes to Reformed Protestantism. You know,
no, I trust me, I know. But we're going to get to a couple of other clips there where he actually starts addressing your citations of the early church fathers, which should be useful. But we'll go ahead and get started with that. Okay.
I'll get myself a minute here. Sardis ready.
Okay.
Why would you start?
Right.
I mean, he says, well, I guess you made some historic Christian belief. Well, I'm going to show you what historic Christian belief. It wasn't Trinitarian. And yet the reality is the quotations, you know, he gives 1 Clement 46:6. Have we not one God and one Christ and one Spirit of grace that was shed upon us? And is there not one calling in Christ? How is that not Trinitarian?
Right.
I was really surprised, because if I were to go to Clement and say, here are some of the significant Christological and theological statements that would reflect, as we have in the New Testament so many places, where the ease of association of Father, Son, and Spirit, or for example, how Paul will talk about in just a couple of verses, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ, same Spirit, and there's an interchange of terminology that indicates that in his mind he's not even seeing that as an issue, which if you're a subordinationist, if you do not believe in the full deity of Christ, this would raise all sorts of issues. But the point is that Clement speaks often of the elect. These are passages that in no way deny a Trinitarian understanding. Right. They're perfectly consistent with the Trinitarian understanding, as is the quotation from the Didache and everything else that's brought up. But I'm just wondering, you know, especially I was really confused with the quotation from Justin Martyr, because Justin Martyr actually is one of the early fathers that makes the argument that Jesus is identified as Jehovah in his dialogue with Trypho.
Okay, well, do you want to start, or
So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
There's another clip that's like this, wherein they just try and go through specific ones. In another clip, I don't think we'll watch it today, but in another clip they talk about Melito of Sardis. Yeah. Saying that, well, if you read Melito, you know, some of his quotes can only be understood in a Trinitarian sense, but all they're demonstrating is that they are reading their presuppositions into those texts. Because as you can probably, as you're probably want to point out, they don't address what your actual reason is for citing those church fathers.
Okay, what was my reason?
So I mean, I've read your response. I can tell
Yeah.
you. So you could correct me if I'm wrong here too, but you're making a very linguistic and textual argument, wherein you are discussing that the early church fathers absolutely saw a distinction between God and Jesus Christ, and we see that same distinction found within the New Testament texts as well.
Yeah. And it's not a distinction of the Father from the Son. It's the distinction of the one God or the one true God from the person of the Father, or sorry, from the person of the Son, which is
Right.
seen all throughout, just not the Greek New Testament, but also the Apostolic Fathers as well. So yeah, I'm not saying like Clement, and I believe First Clement was probably written in the year 69 these days. But be that as it may, I'm not saying Clement was a proto-Mormon, but I'm saying Clement would not have
Right.
had the same triadology as White would hold to. Because if you compare, say, the Forgotten Trinity, and I've read both editions, with that of the Greek and Latin Apostolic Fathers, at most, it's the Eastern Orthodox view that comes out, not White's view, because they do not hold to absolute divine simplicity. Many do not even hold to divine simplicity, like Tertullian, and perhaps one Clement as well. And also,
Hold on, would you explain divine simplicity to me? That's a
divine
little
simplicity,
ironic.
yeah.
Sorry.
Divine simplicity is the idea that God has no parts. But White, I'm not sure if White holds this, but in the Latin West, both Catholic and Protestants generally would hold to what's called absolute divine simplicity. So not only does God not have any parts, but there's no real distinction between God's omnipotence and say God's love or God's creation. God is it's pretty complex, but like if you read, say, the Fourth Lateran Council from the year 1215, chapter 2 on the condemnation of Abbot Joachim, the Fourth Lateran Council goes with Peter Lombard's definition of simplicity, where God and his omnipotence and God and his, say, act of creation or God and his love are actually the same. There's no distinction except through analogy. It's pretty complex, but that's absolute divine simplicity, which is the Latin Western view. The Eastern Orthodox hold the divine simplicity, but because of their energy essence distinction, because they would hold to the Palamite councils in the 13th century and 14th century, they would not hold it out. But it's pretty complex.
All right. Now, I hope that all of your viewers go back and listen to those past 2 minutes again, because I'm sure that we've all missed something in that discussion. But
yeah, I think myself and Blake Oster should actually have a show in divine simplicity and the ultimate rejection of it.
You should, because I hear that term thrown around a lot, and it's thrown in conjunction with a couple of things like the hypostatic union, and I don't think there's a lot of discussion in Latter-day Saint circles about those sorts of topics, and I think they're important because they are relevant in terms of addressing Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant Christologies and that sort of thing. It's important that we as Latter-day Saints understand what other people are talking about, or we can't hope to have any kind of discussion. I think his comments on subordinationism are interesting, though. He was almost implying that subordinationism was like denying the deity of Christ somehow.
No, I mean, you can hold to like functional subordinationism, and that's pretty unanimous at the very least, because if you read the patristics until about the 8th century, almost unanimously, they would have held the view that the Father and the Father alone is autotheos, that is God in an underived sense, but that the Spirit and the Son are not in an Arian sense, but that they are derived from the person of the Father. Now, Calvin rejected that. He actually believed all three were autotheos, and that led to the charge that he was a tritheist, funnily enough. But yeah, the Latin and the Greek fathers were pretty unanimous that the Father and the Father alone was autotheos. So that is some type of at least functional subordinationism, if not ontological subordination. But like just speaking, like say the Apostolic Fathers, Tark, who's a mutual friend of ours, once asked like who my favorite patristic writer was, and I said probably Justin Martyr. Let me actually quote something from Justin Martyr, and this is dialogue with Trypho 56. And they said they had understood him, but that the passage adduced brought forward no proof that there is any other God or Lord, or that the Holy Spirit says besides the maker of all things. Then I replied, I shall attempt to persuade you, since you have understood the scriptures of the truth of what I say, that there is, and that there is said to be, another God and Lord subject to the maker of all things, who is called an angel, because he announces to men whatsoever the maker of all things, above whom there is no other God, wishes to announce to them, and quoting once more the previous passage, I said, Trypho, do you think that God appeared to Abraham under the oak of Mamre, as the scriptures assert? He said, assuredly. And also, First Apology 13. Our teacher of teens is Jesus Christ, who was also born for this purpose and was crucified under Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the times of Tiberius Caesar, and that we recently worship him, having learned that he is son of the true God himself, and holding him in the second place and the prophetic spirit in third, we will prove. And also if you look at, say, for Dialogue Betrothal 56, that's in PG 6597, if you're familiar with Mina. It says, Theos kai kurios heteros, another God and another Lord. So it's not like consubstantial with the one God and one Lord. It's another, i.e. a distinct God and a distinct Lord. And that's right. Justin Martyr. And most scholars would agree Justin was not consistent with Nicene Chalcedonian Christology, at least on certain respects. And just one other, because they do bring up Melita of Sardis, and I'm not sure if you're going to quote him, but they do appeal to Melita. And it's from the work on Pascha, written circa 190. This is what he said about Christ. He is in all things, he is law in that he judges. He is word in that he teaches. He is grace in that he saves. He is father in that he begets. And one scholar, Alistair Stewart Skies, in the Popular Patristic Series, Volume 20, from St. Vladimir Seminary, so I'm guessing this fellow may also be Eastern Orthodox. Note that Christ himself is described here as Father. This is an example of the naive modalism, or better, Christocentric monotheism inspired by Melito. In time, modalism became recognized as heretical because of its inadequacies, but it would be unreasonable to apply such a title to Melito, i.e. heresy, in whose period the complexities of the Trinitarian relationships had not yet been discussed. I actually do have a blog post on this. I also quote something that Errol Amy provided as well.
I was going to say, Errol's talked extensively about this.
He has as well. So at the very least, he was not a Trinitarian. He seems to be like a naive modalist. Maybe not like, say, purposely a modalist, but like his work does not really support, again, the later Nicene Constantinopolitan understanding of the triad and so forth. So again, Wright claims he teaches church history, but he teaches it in, like, say, he used to teach it in Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church and now Apologia Church. But yeah, he really needs to go back, ad fontes to the sources and actually bone up more on patristics and medievals.
Yeah, I do find his argument about Justin Martyr saying that Jesus is Jehovah, that doesn't.
Oh, wait, that's not a problem for us.
That's not a problem for us, no. And it certainly doesn't assume that he's a Trinitarian in the sense that they are now. And yeah. I think both of us would agree that there's certainly been a development in terms of how general Christians have understood God over time.
Yeah, and to really, like, say, his formulation of the Trinity back into the patristics, it's basically anachronistic eisegesis. And I would say it's cultic anachronistic eisegesis. But yeah.
We'll keep going here.
Sure.
Just a second. Right. No, this next one's going to be important too. It might be a little bit longer. I'll have to go back and double check that, but it should be important.
Right.
But if you're going to bring those types of things up, then why not deal with some of the what I would call the monuments from that time period that cannot even begin to be understood from a Mormon perspective, because nothing from Clement is talking about God living on another planet, exaltation to godhood, any of the fundamental places where Mormon soteriology and Mormon theology is so completely disconnected. And it used to be that the argument was, well, they had already gone into apostasy, so why would you expect them to be talking about truthful things?
Right.
Well, then why is he quoting these things? And out of context without any explanation. It just doesn't. The only explanation that comes in my mind is I'm trying to impress you with how much cutting and pasting I can do, because otherwise there's nothing relevant here.
So I'm sorry.
I have to say this. Wright is a friggin' hypocrite, because he will cite Raymond Brown and others who he disagrees with as godless liberals to critique Roman Catholicism. I mean, read his work on Mary, for instance, like Mary, another Redeemer, or his other arguments, or his work against the papacy, like his various debates against the Germatics and Michel-Pacqua. He will quote leftist Roman Catholics, whose worldview he disagrees with, and who he believes to be in great error, not just because they're Romanists, but because they're liberals as well. And yet he will quote them approvingly. you know, and also one can actually quote a source and still disagree with the substance of one's theology as well. I mean, if Bart Ehrman, for instance, brings up a good point about a textual variation, say a manuscript tradition, I don't think it's a problem if I were to quote him approvingly, even if I disagree with his like agnostic, atheistic perspectives, and
Right.
frankly, his piss poor Christology and so forth. Again, White is operating under, he expects his opponents like me to operate under a system that he himself would never do. I mean, again, look at his stuff. He's more than happy to approvingly and positively quote sources from like patristics and medievals where he would disagree with to show, say, purgatory is ahistorical, or the Bodily Assumption of Mary is not apostolic, or the priest of all believers is actually original. It's the sacerdotal priest that is later, like he's work against Roman Catholicism. So, yeah, as someone who's been following his work, not just on Mormonism, but other topics for like about 20 years, I can spot the BS coming from White instantaneously. But yeah, that's just me. I'll let you say what you want to hear.
No, you're just fine. I'm glad you were able to get that out of your system. It felt like, yeah, I can sense you wanted to say that for a little while, but there's unfortunately I'm inclined to agree with you, and unfortunately for Dr. White, the I don't think he's fully understanding what he's saying when he's talking about the sort of thing, because from my view, the fact that you are able to pull from a variety of different scholars, from a variety of different worldviews in support of a subject helps indicate strength in an argument, not weakness.
It shows that there's a convergence regardless of like the preconceived theological agendas of the authors. I mean, like an analogous would be like, say, was there a historical Jesus? You have atheist scholars, you have agnostic scholars, you have Jewish scholars, you have various Christian scholars, all converging at the very least. Yeah, there was some guy called Jesus who existed. And if you look at, say, the gymnastics, like Carrier et al. Have to engage in to like critique this. They might say like, well, the religious bias. It's like, my dude, like Amy Jill Levine is like, frankly, a godless Jew. She's not really, very pro-conservative religion here. Or Maurice Casey of all people defending the historical Jesus as well. And he was a godless liberal as well. Again, it's a convergence. And if you see a convergence in scholarship, it's not to say scholarship is infallible, but
Right.
if scholars from various perspectives all converge more or less on a certain agreement, that's worthy of consideration as to why that's the case, and so on and so forth. I'm sure like White, if he were to engage in like some type of evidentialism, not simply just presuppositionalism, would do the same thing if he were to debate like, say, a Christ mythicist.
No, I'm inclined to agree with you. When we should be willing to look for things in scholarship where if it's a good sign if there are data points that scholars could look at and find something to agree on. That I think that, like I said before, that adds strength to an argument, not necessarily weakness. If we can acknowledge patterns that we see in the data, we should be able to take a little bit of comfort in knowing that it's more likely to be true. There are a couple of other things I want to bring up. James White, I don't think he's understanding what we talk about when we talk about our church being the quote unquote restored church. You aptly point out, you were the first person to point this out to me, and I appreciate it. I've held on to it since. D&C 128, I believe, where it talks a little bit about how in our dispensation there are things that we see that weren't present in previous dispensations.
Yeah, that's verse 18.
18, that's right. And it's like partway through the verse, but it's just like a little hidden gem in there, because it points out this idea that, yes, we believe that this is Christ's restored church, but it is restored in the sense that it belongs to him and has his power and authority. Not necessarily that every single teaching has to match up exactly one for one from what we see in previous dispensations. Now, granted, some members of the church may have said that much or may have believed that much, but if you go back and listen to like some of the early apostles talk, if you go back and listen to Joseph Smith's writings, if you listen to modern scholarship in LDS circles today, that's what they're working off of. And great exploration of this is this book right here, Ancient Christians, from the BYU Religious Studies. The first chapter goes into that extensively. And I think that's worth mentioning, and I am frustrated and disappointed in the fact that James White doesn't acknowledge those kinds of things when he discusses how Anderson
I'm not going to lie to you. I doubt he's even familiar with the passage. In fact, let me just quote it. This is the second half of section 128, verse 18. It's a very important text. For it is necessary in the ushering in of the dispensation of the fullness of times, which dispensation is now beginning to usher in, that a whole and complete and perfect union and welding together of dispensations and keys and powers and glories should take place and be revealed from the days of Adam even to the present time. And not only this, but those things which never have been revealed from the foundation of the world, but have been kept hid from the wise and prudent, shall be revealed unto babes and sucklings in this, the dispensation of the fullness of the times. This also supports the idea, like from Dieter Uchtdorf from a few years ago, that the restoration is an ongoing process as well.
Yes, that was another thing I was going to bring up. It's
just as really the apostasy was and is, I would say, an ongoing process as well. The restoration, yes, we have the authority, we have the true and living church, but and that's the objective reception of these things. But the subjective reception is like the church dwelling on these things, additional public revelation, and so forth, and the expanding upon these issues as well is ongoing as well.
Right, and that's another thing I wanted to bring up. And there's another clip, I think we'll skip it, but there are a couple of clips we'll skip here. But basically, to go over this, they James White and Jeff Durban, they talk a little bit about the concept of deification. And they hound LES apologists for being willing to cite the early church fathers in that regard. And to be fair, I mean, I'd be curious. What would be your take on that specifically? Because I think both of us would agree that the early church fathers' concept of deification doesn't match up exactly per se with our concept of exaltation. Would you say that's fair? Am I missing something there, or?
Around this time of the 2nd century, and you see this with Irenaeus, circa 180, the idea like the assumption God created ex nihilo was more or less becoming more and more mainstream. So once you believe in creatio ex nihilo, and as a result that there's a true species distinction between us, God, and angels, that will put a hamper, if you will, on the concept of theosis. However, the assumptions going into the apostolic fathers and the later patristics when it comes to theosis is not the glorification way in Calvinism that you read in, say, the Westminster Confession of Faith and other sources. They tied it into the nature of justification, which they believe to be, again, transformative. Again, look at my work on justification, especially against imputed righteousness, or get Alistair McGrath's book, Justitia Dei, for a very good discussion about the history of justification. But again, the assumptions, they would have, some of their assumptions would be not like Latter-day Saints, like, but at the same time, it clearly was not proto-Protestant as well, with the idea of glorification when the Reformed view. They would have viewed like as a participation in the energies of at God. And again, which is like a very Eastern Orthodox view, it's pretty inconsistent in the Catholic view. But also one other thing to realize is like for the patristics and medieval, and to some medievals as well, the grace that you participate in is not a created grace. It's the energia of God, which is uncreated. Because Catholics are a bit inconsistent with this, but if you're familiar with the Reformed doctrine of justification, Christ in his incarnation merited passively and actively this created grace that is forensically imputed to people. But if you look at the patristics, they would speak and say how Christ, through his incarnation, or at the incarnation, won grace for God, or that, deification is a participation in the energia, or the essence of God, or his uncreated energies as well. It kind of gets a bit complex, but I really doubt why he's familiar with this.
And I would say, before we move on to one more topic here, because there's one more thing that I think we'll talk about with this. That interpretation seems odd to me. If you're saying that Christ is inheriting something, or like inheriting grace, that almost would, to me, my first inclination is like, wait, they're separating Christ from that energy of God, or that power of God.
Well, it kind of goes back to say the covenant of works. Like historic Calvinists would believe that if Adam were to obey God perfectly in the Garden of Eden, he would not have fallen. And to undo this, we need a source of grace that is perfect, both actively and passively. So Christ, from the moment of his conception onto his death, actively, through his active and passive obedience, perfect obedience to God, generated or created this kind of created grace, not uncreated grace. And that created grace is forensically imputed to the accounts of the elect once they're irresistibly drawn in Reformed theology.
No, that's interesting. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. But the one thing I also want to point out is that one pattern that we Latter-day Saints would accept is that prophets have a way of being able to interact with the culture around them to help suggest to teach a specific point. An example of this in the biblical texts, I can think of two. One of them is in Acts 17, I believe, where Paul is citing a poet, and that's what he describes. Talking about when he's talking about the fact that you are God's children, sorry, you're the children of God, and that everyone's a child of God. And you have an extensive exegesis on that too. I know some people would try to disagree with that, but I'm inclined to believe that Paul wouldn't have cited him if he didn't think it was a good idea, or if he didn't think everyone was a child of God.
That's my view. He cites him approvingly.
Yes.
And it does, and this poet does say, like, you are the genus, the offspring of God. But Paul is actually affirming this.
Yes.
And he's speaking not to people who are born again Christians. He's actually speaking to everyone. Because Wright would say that the only people who are true sons and daughters of God, or the only sons and daughters of God, are actually those who have been regenerated. Christians, basically. But Paul is addressing non-believers.
Yes.
As the offspring or genus of God. And this is known by commentators, because he likes to quote liberal scholars. Let me quote Fitzmyer, page 611 of the Anchor Bible Commentary in Acts. In quoting this verse, Lucan Paul makes a new point in part 3 of his address. God is not only near to human beings, but they are related to him as king. Paul understands the Stoic idea in a biblical sense. Compare Psalm 139, Luke 3:38, that speaks of Adam as the Son of God. So, and again, he's not speaking simply to like converted believers. He's actually speaking to non-believers, the unregenerate.
And so my thought is, as I read that sort of thing, my question goes to, okay, so if Paul could do that, why can't we have modern leaders cite back to the early church fathers saying, look, they believed in a similar concept of deification. Let's take that, and I'm going to, via inspiration, explain more deeply about what's going on.
Also, again, we kind of see the hypocrisy when it comes to Wright, when it comes to patristics, because this has come out a lot, but most recently this came out during the cross-ex period of his sola scriptura debate with Trent Horn, that I reviewed with a few others, including like an ex-LDS Baptist. And he basically said, like, the Church of the 4th century believed in the sacerdotal priesthood, which he believed be basic blasphemous nonsense, and baptismal regeneration, which he rejects as a Reformed Baptist. But, they got the canon right. So, he's more than willing to, like, say, be very selective when it comes to, say, the patristics. Like, take Augustine, for instance, or Augustine, as Blake Oster likes to call him, probably properly as well. Augustine believed justification was transformative. He believed in prayer to saints. He believed in Mary's sinlessness and perpetual virginity. He had a different ecclesiology than James White. But White will actually approvingly quote him because he can be proof texted to teach sola scriptura here and there, because he did believe local councils could be improved upon or could err. Or there was like this when he was in a debate with Arian, he said, like, well, you can't quote, I won't quote Nicaea against you. You can't quote like one of the semi-Arian creeds from the Council of Ariminum against me. We'll just go to the Holy Scriptures to settle this, as if Augustine was a sola scripturist. Again, let's just say Augustine did hold the sola scriptura. I don't believe he did, but let's just say he did. White has to reject like a lot of other things Augustine taught. And the same when it comes to Athanasius, who he likes to quote as well. Like Athanasius believed in prayers to Mary, her sinlessness, that she was the Ark of the New Covenant, perpetual virgin, transformative understanding of justification, baptismal regeneration, infant baptism. You compare that with, say, White as a Reformed Baptist. Athanasius not believing, let's say, the Vatican I understanding the papacy. I'll grant you that. But he was not also a proto-Protestant, let alone a proto-Reformed Baptist. So again, like, you can go to like someone and agree with them on a certain point they make, and yet still you can consistently reject most of the other things they teach as well, if you have a good grounding for that particular reason. For instance, like I've done a lot of work in, say, baptismal regeneration, look at, say, the Greek text of the patristics when necessary, like for instance, they all believe in baptismal regeneration, to a man, and I'm more than right to actually say this is at least one doctrine, albeit it's not unique to LDS, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Anglicans and Lutherans believe in as well. That's pretty unanimous. but that doesn't mean I have to accept everything that say like Epiphanius taught. It's just like if there's a convergence of belief in this universal belief in a certain doctrine, that should tell you something, especially if it's from East and West.
And one thing I've noticed with James White is that he has this pattern of absolutizing people as classifying them as reliable or unreliable, and we can't just like take out specific teachings and say, hey, this makes sense and this corresponds to truth that we have right now.
Yeah, as someone who actually works professionally in history, that's you can't like take an either or approach.
Yeah.
You have to take it on a evidence by evidence or item by item basis.
Fallacies abound in his exegesis, unfortunately.
He's not actually that smart.
Well, there are a couple of other clips here. We are going to skip a few just for the sake of time.
Sure.
He does make while I jump over to this next clip here, he does make one comment about Jeremiah 10 in an attempt to talk about how Jeremiah 10 teaches that there are no other gods that exist, something to the tune of that. Jeremiah 10:11, if you actually cite, however, if you go back and read, he says that because it's written in Aramaic, something like that, you should it was something that was this powerful manifestation of how these early prophets are teaching people that other gods just don't exist, that sort of thing. And if you go back and actually do some look at the actual scholarship regarding that issue, there's a different story being told, wherein, for example, many scholars now are more inclined to believe that that was just kind of a later extrapolation, or that was a later scribal insertion.
Well, we can discuss that, but if you want to just play what he says first, then we can discuss it.
Yeah, I can. It's just it's a little bit of a longer clip, and there are other things I want to get to.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I'll get the summary view. Basically says because it appears in Aramaic, this is the only Aramaic verse in the book of Jeremiah. Yes. That means that Jeremiah is breaking from the Hebrew and quoting directly from the people, who would be speaking Aramaic during the exilic period. So, this is like a evidence that of its authenticity and so forth. So there are like conservative scholars who don't believe that it's authentic for this reason. For instance, Lawrence Boat, who was a conservative Roman Catholic, in his commentary on Jeremiah 1, the 25, page 88. The scriptures possess many such small additions, but few can be identified so easily as this one. And he gives reasoning why. I can quote it on my blog. Another, who's actually a conservative scholar, John A. Thompson, in his New International Commentary on the Old Testament. So it's a very conservative Protestant commentary series as well. Probably this Aramaic verse, which interrupts the flow of verses 10, 12, and 13, represents a scribal commentary, and it may represent a marginal note added later by an Aramaic speaker. So, conservative scholars, not just like liberals, believe more than likely this is not original to Jeremiah. It interrupts the flow of the Hebrew and so forth. It may have been like a addition, or maybe like a marginal note that may have been added to the text. Like an analogous would be the verse in John 5 where it speaks like the angel coming down to the pool of Siloam and making it holy. Many New Testament scholars believe that's a later insertion, and some believe it may have been like originally a marginal note that made its way into the main body of the text. But even then, like, let's just say Jeremiah 10:11 is authentic. There's an excellent book by D. Charles Pyle, I Have Said Ye Are Gods. Very good book. He basically says on page 308, the phrase from the earth and from under these heavens plainly refers to the here and now, or life on this earth and under the sky. And as the context shows, it is referring to the idols and graven images of nations, rather than those that would become gods through the grace and atonement of Christ, or who already were gods and hence in heaven. Critics, of course, would also deny this. But the passage also nowhere states that the gods who are in heaven would perish, nor does this passage specify that there were no other gods under God in heaven. And we know that this is the case, for the Bible refers to the gods as the God of gods, just as he is King of kings and Lord of lords, and we know that other lords and other kings are real beings. So other gods must also be in like manner exist. And he kind of goes on about this, but yeah,
I don't mean to interrupt, but I have D. Charles Pyle's quotation in my gospel library notes because I thought it was useful.
Yeah, by the way, someone was asking about good books to read to enter apologetics. This is one that's actually very good. I would actually suggest reading this one first before you read Blake Oster's Of God and Gods, because this is not as technical, but it's still very good. So
so it's that was one thing I wanted to bring up. It's also we've already gone to this tangent long enough, but it's again, it's hypocritical that James White would be willing to refer to his, it almost seems odd to me that James White would refer to his interpretation of that as being the true and living interpretation. He doesn't say, well, other scholars believe this thing and this thing. And so in a way, he's doing the exact same thing he's accusing you of doing when he's talking about.
By the way, notice, like, I'm more than willing to discuss, like, say, the scholarship, like, say, the varying views and its authenticity. If you look at my blog, whenever I discuss Jeremiah 10, 11, like, you know, there's conservative scholars who believe it's a later insertion. Some actually believe it's original to the text, and I've quoted them on other blog posts for a repository of notes. You know, and as we discussed here, like, even if you take it as authentic, it's not actually an issue for anyone familiar with actual Latter-day Saint theology. He does not even mention this. You know, and the very fact it's Aramaic has indicated to conservative scholars like the NIC OT commentary series, which is not liberal by any stretch of the imagination. And it's probably like a later scribal gloss that was made its way into the text. You know, and for someone who prides himself on his ability at textual criticism, this is bad form.
Yeah, and it shoots biblical inerrancy in the foot, depending on how you define that. But but that's my point. But that's my point exactly. I don't view James White as being, in this regard, I don't view him as being dishonest as much as he's coming at this from a specific purpose, and we shouldn't be expected to flush everything out. We shouldn't be trying to play this game of every time we cite a source, we have to basically cite, okay, this is a liberal scholar, this is from several decades ago, this person didn't have access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We shouldn't have to do that sort of thing in order to cite things. Like, if people have questions, we should be willing to bring that up. But I don't think that playing this game of look, because he doesn't cite X, Y, and Z things, therefore I consider him to be a dishonest actor. I don't see how that's useful or practical in any way. And that's just kind of my thought, but we'll go ahead and keep going here. All right, this is a good one.
Yeah,
Here, clip 11.
How many clips do you have?
18, but we're certainly not going to go through all of them.
Attempts to go after Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone is what he quotes there. He says this: the Shema is often cited as an evidence of strict monotheism. However, most biblical scholars agree that the Shema is not about the number of God, but instead is about how Yahweh is the only God with whom Israel is to have a covenantal relationship with.
Yeah, it's interesting how you define biblical scholars. When it comes to Old Testament scholarship today, in the majority of seminaries, I would say the vast majority of them no longer believe in biblical monotheism because of their view of the Old Testament, because they view it as a much later document. It is not written by who it says it was written by, or there really wasn't a Moses, etc., etc. Again, these are things that Joseph Smith never would have believed either. But we can skip over that part, evidently, if you're a Mormon. But sadly, we do need to recognize that if you go to the place that I warn people about is the most dangerous place for a Christian spiritually. It's called a Christian bookstore.
Yeah.
If you don't realize as you walk down those aisles, you need to view those aisles as filled with coiled snakes. But when you go to the biblical commentary section, that's when they are really poisonous vipers. Because once they strike, the poison may be slow, but it is almost always fatal. Because the point is that much of what is published on the Old Testament today, not all of it, but much of what is published on the Old Testament today, accepts the idea of a fundamentally evolutionary nature of the Old Testament. It doesn't take Jesus' view of the Old Testament.
That's the point.
You're not allowed to have Jesus' view of the Old Testament anymore. You've got to accept, you've got the Yahwists and the Elohists and the Deuteronomists and the priestly sources, and it's all been redacted, and it's really a post-exilic, almost all of it, blah, blah, blah. And once you buy that, there is no Old Testament theology. There is no Old Testament view of God. And you can accept the idea that the earliest Jews were completely polytheistic. And at that point, you just throw your hands up in the air and you go, wait a minute, the Jesus that I believe in, used the Old Testament and viewed the Old Testament and honored the Old Testament in a way that none of these people can even begin to understand anymore. So what can I learn from them?
So, a little bit to unpack there, but those are actually clips that I put inside my response to the Gospel for Mormons, at least the video portion, because I thought it was useful. James White and Jeff Durbin hold a very black and white view on biblical scholarship. It is pretty much, and unfortunately, it's something I picked up from a lot of people who are Reformed and people who try to evangelize to members of the church. Basically, it's this view of everyone who disagrees with us is a godless liberal and should be avoided and ignored. And, you know, as James White talked about, he's basically saying they're poisonous vipers, where the poison is slow, but it's always lethal. That kind of sensationalist language. And it bothers me a little bit because I'm very sensitive to people poisoning the well. And I don't like the idea of only looking at, you know, I don't like the idea of discounting arguments per se as just because of where they're coming from. That's not to say that people aren't full of crap sometimes, but I mean, it just happens so consistently that it just feels like it's them. It almost feels like a cop out to me
Yeah,
when and I don't get behind that sort of thing.
and if you read the section on, say, where it discussed the Shema or Deuteronomy 6:4, I did kind of provide evidence from the text of Deuteronomy itself, showing that the ontological, that is, the real existence of other deities, is affirmed, like in Deuteronomy 32, 7, 9, and 43, like the Dead Sea Scrolls textual issue. And I even go through like the Hebrew Genesis 20, verse 13, and a couple of other texts as well. So it's not like, say, well, he quotes like godless liberals. It's like, why are they saying this is the case? You know, and you don't even have to take, say, the documentary hypothesis perspective. You can just take the text of Exodus or Deuteronomy or Genesis as it currently exists and extrapolate these things using historical grammatical exegesis. But they just basically try to like portray you as like a godless liberal. And then they say like, well, what about the take of Jesus on the Gospels? I mean, you know, sometimes they'll appeal to say Mark 10:5, John 5:46 to 47.
They'll appeal to Mark 7 in these clips. But go
Yeah.
on.
Oh, yeah, like the Corban rulings. That's where the Corban rule is discussed. Like when it comes to say Mark, those passages, all it does is like Christ says that Moses wrote the commandments concerning divorce, and in John 10, Christ tells his opponents that if they believe Moses, they would believe Jesus since Moses wrote about him. However, that does not like ascribe like the entire Pentateuch to Moses. And we don't know if even those who would hold as the traditional view of Mosaic authorship, much of the book of Genesis has been redacted and edited to bring it up, like, say, then current times, like the king lists or the place names and so forth. So there has been some editing of the text, even from a conservative perspective.
It's not stuff that you can just brush aside as being liberal scholarship by any stretch of the margin.
No, I'm not a godless liberal when it comes to this, but like I do think there's very good evidence for, like, say, editing and so forth. Not to the same degree as, say, the Wellhausian hypothesis, which very few people hold today. But yeah, there has been redaction. But even if you hold like a traditional perspective, just taking the Hebrew text and the Septuagint text of the Pentateuch as it is now, using historical grammatical exegesis, there's still, people like Durban et al. Are up the crapper when it comes to this kind of particular issue. And, it's been a while since I actually watched in total the review, but I don't think they actually meaningfully engage with exegesis, historical grammatical exegesis of many points I engage in or discuss. They just try to brush it aside.
And as we've seen, we're maybe we're maybe a significant portion into their interview, and we've mostly covered everything substantial that they brought up. Like, I've really tried to be fair in how I'm representing their arguments, but so far, like as we've been able to see, they don't address your arguments so much as they are just attacking worldviews and doing that sort of thing. And that those kinds of discussions can only take you so far.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is in your clips, but like they kind of bitched the fact I actually would quote Anthony Buzzard, who's a Unitarian. But here's the thing, Buzzard.
That's in one of the clips. That's later.
Oh, okay. So we'll discuss that and why I would quote someone who holds to a Socinian Christology. But they also claim I don't know Hebrew and stuff like that. And perhaps that's in your clips as well. We can discuss that.
Yes, it is. That is in one of those clips. I think it's in one of the ones that we skipped, though.
Okay. Well, let me
first
just
off, you
address
do
that.
know Hebrew.
Yeah. I studied Hebrew and also Biblical Greek in the Pontifical University of Ireland. I mean, I even was allowed to do it at a postgraduate level while I was still an undergrad. My pronunciation sucks, but I can actually work my way through Greek and Hebrew reasonably well even now. Not to the same extent as Stephen Smoot, who's doing his PhD, but I know when someone's trying to BS me when it comes to biblical languages, especially Greek. And why did I quote someone like Anthony Buzzard? He's a linguist. Yes, he's a Socinian. I've written against his Christology, like how he butchers Hebrews 1:10-12. But here's the thing. He's a linguist who knows Greek and Hebrew like the back of his hand and modern languages like the back of his hand. It's his expertise in languages and linguistics, I was appealing to. And the very fact, yes, he's a Unitarian. So what?
That has no
what
bearing.
he said about the meaning of ehad,
Right, and it has no bearing on
fallacy.
textual arguments.
Yeah, it's just a genetic fallacy. Like he quote like a leading advocate of Socinian Christology. Let's dismiss it as like, you honestly think I would hold to Socinian Christology? Yeah, I know. I've read all of Anthony Buzzard's books, or at least most of them, including D2 works defending Unitarianism. But again, he's a linguist. He has degrees in the relevant linguistic fields, and his article is a linguistic analysis of why the pop level arguments about ehad, meaning compound unity, and this all utter nonsense, that just doesn't hold up when you do a lexical analysis of ehad and how it's used in the Hebrew Bible. Like the king list, which I reproduced, like each king is referred to as ehad, or Abraham is said to be ehad. It's a refutation, like say, possible silly counters, some like Robert Morey have argued.
The one more thing, because I appreciate you mentioning that sort of thing. Like this, as we pointed out multiple times here, there's a lot of genetic fallacy stuff being cited by them. They make one comment about Joseph Smith, not accepting these sorts of things. But it's my understanding that Joseph Smith was very quick to point out that he accepted the biblical texts insofar as they originated from the original authors, so what he esteemed to be from the original authors.
Yeah, and he said that like later scribes and editors at times corrupted the text. We also have the 8 article of faith where it's said to be as true as translated correctly. And as some of the spine now translated at that time referred not simply to say how you would translate, say, Irish into English, as I sometimes do, and vice versa, but like transmission as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's that's an important distinction I think is also to be made. But we'll move on to this next one. This one is kind of interesting. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on it.
But very, very quickly, once the Mormons at BYU and up in Salt Lake and Provo started realizing that they could use liberal Christianity against those who were evangelizing Muslims, what they did not realize is that they put directly into the vein of Mormonism a straight track to its own destruction. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing this today. Once they started sending people out to get degrees outside of Provo and Salt Lake City, outside of the U of U and BYU, so that they could be more mainstream, what they didn't realize was you start buying into the liberal Christianity stuff to argue against Christianity, guess what? Mm-hmm. Those people are going to come back and they're going to start applying the same things to Mormonism. And Mormonism can't even begin to defend itself. So once you start trying to apply redaction criticism and text criticism to the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Progress Price, you start finding all sorts of things that you simply cannot defend. You start seeing that archaeology in the Book of Mormon and all of the textual issues and the revisions that are done. You start looking at the 1833 Commandments and the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants and the changes between them, and everything just starts falling apart. And that's what's going on right now. Mormonism is, the Mormon leadership is now publishing books about stuff that back in the late 1980s, I was carrying big old photocopies around with me going, see, here's Joseph Smith and the Seer Stone. Well, now they've published pictures of the Seer Stone. They had it in their archives the whole time. It's just amazing. What's now being put out by the church. And the people are looking at this and going, wait a minute, Joseph Smith did this, Joseph Smith did that, and now the church is admitting this? They didn't realize, they just simply didn't realize that by sending their people out to try to do the mainstreaming, to try to use liberal Christianity in defense of Mormonism, it was drinking cyanide. And the changes that we're seeing are directly related to that. And it's funny, men like this are finding themselves more and more and more in the minority.
Right.
And this is why.
Yeah.
And this is why.
So,
Okay, so many
remind me
hints.
where you got your degrees from, good sir?
The Pontifical University of Ireland in Maynooth and the NUI Maynooth as well for my anthropology. So
So, certainly not Provo in Salt Lake City.
no, but there's so much nonsense. Sarah Allen did say the polygamy beard seems to be coming back this season, but yeah, already like I'll rattle off like a few things that immediately come to mind. First of all, it's obvious will poisoning, which is really common for why he loves to do that. There's been a lot of very good stuff on, say, the pre-exilic biblical texts in, like, say, modern scholarship and how that vindicates the Book of Mormon, like a Benjamin Maguire's essay, Nephi and Goliath, which shows that it doesn't deal with the Pentateuch, but it deals with like 1 Samuel 16 to 18, and how the Book of Mormon, especially in 1 Nephi 3 to 4, is using the A but not later B source of it in its reworking of the David Goliath, Nephi, Laban narrative. It's a bit technical, but it's an excellent article and it's never been refuted.
And say that article one more time. I want to look into that.
Yeah, sure. Nephi and Goliath. It was published in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies a couple of years ago.
Got it. I'll look into that.
Also, like when it comes to, say, scholars being sent off to get degrees, one that comes to mind was Sidney Sperry, but he was a very conservative, believing Book of Mormon scholar to the day of his death. And you kind of, you see this like when it comes to like, you look at the best LDS scholars in, say, the Book of Mormon, like Brant Garner, Jerry Grover, those at Scripture Central, like Neil Rapley. They're familiar with the scholarship, but they're not godless liberals. I actually know them personally. They're actually very good friends of mine, like Neil and Stephen Smoot. Yeah. They would hold Book of Mormon historicity, as I do. Let's see, textual criticism. Look up the work of Cyril Skousen. He shows the earlier you go, the more complex the text is. And I really doubt White has actually bothered in anything by Cyril Skousen, except maybe like a few quote lines here and there. And when it comes to archaeology in the Book of Mormon, again, I know White has skimmed an ancient American saying for the Book of Mormon, but I really doubt he's ever read it. And I really doubt he's ever read anything by, say, Brant Garner, like Traditions of the Fathers, Jerry Grover's excellent work in showing about the geology and its Mesoamerican setting and its relationship to the Book of Mormon, or anything in the Old World.
Yes,
like
the Old World stuff in particular.
Or the Seal of Mulek, or a host of other things as well. He's never engaged with it, and I know that for a fact. And also when it comes to, say, prophets, like the changes in the Book of Commandments and Doctrine and Covenants, if we're up to crapper, so is he, because I actually have a lengthy article, prophets changing their revelations and the revelations of other prophets. I think it's something to that effect. It's a very early blog post. But if you look at, say, sometimes biblical prophets would change their own revelations and sometimes rework the revelations of other prophets, like Isaiah 36 to 39, 2 Samuel 18 to 20, or 2 Kings 18 to 20, and a host of other texts as well. And the Book of Obadiah is like notorious for this, so there's a lot more. And when it comes to, say, knowledge of the use of the seer stone, my dude, that was published in like church magazines for kids as well. Just because like the normie LDS may not be familiar with it, it was still talked about in some circles as well. Granted, not to the same extent as it is now because of the internet and other venues, but still, just go and say the B.H. Roberts Foundation, mormonor.org, and there's like a listing of stuff on the translation process. And Fair actually has an article on this as well. I'm sure Sarah Allen, who I think he's still in the chat, her response to the CES letter as well. But that's just me like rattling off a couple things as well. So,
and again, Sarah's incredible. Like, if your viewers haven't looked into what Sarah Allen has done for the CES letter, I could not more strongly encourage them to look into it. 10 out of 10. But no, I'm inclined to agree with you. He makes all kinds of assertions.
By the way, Sarah is here, so like shout out to Sarah. Everyone look at her CES response. But she was saying, I was going to say the Old World evidence from the Book of Mormon is really solid, even more so than the New World evidence. So yeah, that's true. But White has never interacted with the Old World evidence at all, except maybe just dismiss it as like silly or reliant on the King James or some other crap.
And the you said all the stuff I was going to say, and just a lot of these topics have been addressed very thoroughly, and I find their arguments to be compelling and useful. And so,
it just shows White has not really moved out of the 90s. And it's not when it comes to Mormonism, even Roman Catholicism, Michael, say what you will about him, I do think he's a bit of a Pope splainer, but Michael Lofton, the Reason Theology, has like this running meme where, White will always go back to say he's debates with Jerry Mattox in the 90s, but without really engaging, like, say, scholarship or apologetics from the other side since then. And it's the same when it comes to Mormonism as well. Like he always mentions like how his sister-in-law, who's twins with his wife, met the elders and they went to James, and the elders read and race, and how he only had a few scriptures memorized, but like afterwards he had like hundreds of scriptures memorized, and like how he and Rich Pierce, went to like Salt Lake for the first time in a beat up car, and it's just like basically story time with Uncle Jimmy these days. It's pathetic.
I skipped one clip, but mostly because it's stuff we already talked about in terms of like Mosaic authorship and how the New Testament represents Mosaic authorship, that sort of thing. We already kind of talked about that.
Sure.
So
you're saying you can accept Mosaic authorship and still come to like many of these conclusions as well. Again, it's historical grammatical exegesis of the extant text.
Mm-hmm.
It's not reliant simply. You don't have to be reliant upon, like, say, the thesis of some vis-a-vis the evolution of Israelite theology.
Mm-hmm. And we should be careful by just saying, just because Jesus is represented as, saying Moses said, that all that says is that Jesus says that Moses claimed X, Y, and Z things. That's not necessarily him affirming absolutely everything in the Old Testament. There's a different thing. That's a different thing. That's a different
and by the way, Sarah did remind me like how you, as well as Jen, literally did a podcast episode about the seer stone. So everyone check out Me, Myself, and I, which is the Fair podcast. And I think there's a specific episode just on, like, say, the church discussing this in its history as well. So so thanks to Sarah for the reminder. But yeah.
Sarah was the one that focused in on that episode, and she did a spectacular job with great interviews. But we'll continue with this specific clip here. They actually address. I think this is their best attempt here at addressing one of your points. So, we'll watch this.
I think we should look at how Jesus viewed the Shema, and that's actually recorded for us, and he quotes it in the article, which is interesting. In Mark chapter 12, verse 28. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he had answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is, and here's the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And he goes on to quote the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now this is what's interesting. Jesus is asked by this scribe, what's the greatest commandment? And then Jesus responds with the two, but he quotes the Shema. Now, all of this discussion, all of this argumentation about compound unity and the lexicon source and all that stuff, we need to look at how Jesus viewed it and how the Jews of Jesus' day viewed it. And when Jesus quotes the Shema, the scribe says to him in verse 32, you are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one and there is no other besides him. Now, he listens to Deuteronomy. He knows the Shema, he hears it, and he says, you're right, there is no other God. One God. That's how he hears Deuteronomy 6. And that's how they understood it. Now the question is, does Jesus chastise him here? Does Jesus say, no, you misunderstood me. I wasn't talking about compound unity and all the rest. He quotes it, the man, you're right, there is only one God. Jesus says to him in response that he had answered wisely, and he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. So he hears the Shema and understands there's only one God. That was their pledge of allegiance. There's only one God. And that was his understanding. So all of this discussion about compound unity and all these difficult things can't ultimately address the way that Jesus interprets Scripture, the way that they heard it, what the Scriptures actually say.
Within the context of believing Christianity or even historical Mormonism,
right,
that took these things seriously. The way around that for the liberal, just so people understand, when the liberal looks at that, the liberal says that's just simply Mark's understanding. He's putting words in Jesus' mouth, and Mark was a first century person, and that's all they understood.
Right.
And that's how they get it. And if you go that direction, then you have no foundation left for any scripture whatsoever,
right,
whether it be Mormon or anything else.
That's right.
And so if they try to go that direction, once again, the result is the destruction of their own scriptures and their own system.
Yes.
In defense of that system. It's a self-destructive action.
So, a lot to bring up there. The let's see. Yeah, so they cite Mark 12:28, and good for them for actually like bringing up one of the arguments that you bring up. Now they use this verse as an attempt to discredit you, but what they don't realize they've done is they've actually proved your point. Because what they failed to notice is that they are again reading their idea of monotheism back into the text, but they also don't cite the very next part of your reply, which really brings this point home.
Yeah,
Because Jesus immediately
Mark 12,
cites,
35 to 38, yeah.
yeah, because immediately after this, Jesus cites, I believe it's Psalm 110.
Yeah, 110 in the Hebrew, 109 in the Septuagint.
Right. And so the point there is that Jesus is identifying himself as the second Lord in Psalm 110:1. So, because in the very first, in that verse, I believe it's like, the Lord said unto my lords, sit upon my throne, something like that. So there are two lords there. One of them is the capital Lord, that's the tetragrammaton, and the other one is Lord in like a lowercase.
Yeah, in Hebrew it's Adonai, yeah.
Right. And Jesus in that line is identifying himself as the second Lord, not the first.
So
And
what would that
so,
mean for the one God in the previous pericope? He's identifying that not with the Trinity or with himself, but the singular person of the Father. Again, it's monarchical, not monotheism. It's, which they also argue is like LDS theology, but proceeding from that. Again, unless Chris James wants to become Eastern Orthodox or something like that, again, it's not consistent with his model of the Trinity as spelled out in these confessions, as well as both editions of the Forgotten Trinity.
mhm. And my biggest concern at that point, I was like, hold on, there's no way you were able to read that and then just skipped the next line.
It's immediately afterwards.
It's immediately afterwards in the actual response, and it's right there. Like, you haven't changed that article at all.
No, I've only
And-
updated like maybe some typos and stuff like that, but yeah.
But no, that was, I know for a fact that was certainly there. And the fact that
Yeah.
they reference it indicates they at least read that part. And so I'm disappointed that they didn't really bring your point home and try to address that. Maybe they were concerned about time things, but this came out 7 years ago, and they haven't touched it since. And so I'm a little bit bothered by that in particular, because I felt like they were misrepresenting your argument.
Now,
And
if it was like,
that's
say,
frustrating.
if it was like, say, a point I made, like, say, in a different blog post years after, years before, they'd be forgiven for it. But it's immediately afterwards. You cannot honestly miss it. You know?
Mhm.
So,
And if I remember correctly, you have like different colored text too, so it really pops out at you.
it does.
Or yeah.
Yeah.
And
I use different coloring just to show the Hebrew of Genesis 20 verse 13, but yeah. Which they never interacted with, but
No.
different.
And that's an unfortunate commonality that we see. But clip 15 is another longer one. Oh, I remember this one. All right, yeah, we'll go, and we might just pause and deal with each one individually, but we'll see how it
So
goes.
and we can address some of that here too, but I want to.
Yeah, we'll wrap up.
Okay, so the question about the person of Christ, he brings up John 1:1. He brings up Colossians. Mormons teach that Jesus Christ is a literal offspring of Heavenly Father and one of his goddess wives.
Okay, hold on, sorry, I have to make one insertion there. They, in their Gospel for Mormons pamphlet, cite where they get this from. They cite like it's one of the messages from the First Presidency volumes. But if you go to the actual citation, it doesn't say anything about goddess wives, period. And you can go back, like I have the picture of that source because they have it at the BYU library. And so I took a picture for hopefully I won't get in trouble for that. But the point is, I remember reading this and thinking, how in the world are you getting multiple goddess wives from that? The one that I think of when I think of the only source I can think of that discusses multiple goddess wives is Orson Pratt's The Seer, which was publicly condemned in the church population by the leadership at large.
And Orson himself.
And Orson himself. I didn't know about the Orson himself part,
No,
but that's good to know.
He basically like admitted like he was in error and he accepted the First Presidency's counsel against him. We actually have the entire article on the Mormon Or website.
Which is an excellent resource, by the way. You've mentioned it a couple times. It's spectacular.
Well, I'm biased because I work full-time as a research analyst, but yeah, I agree.
Well, I don't, and so that makes me an unbiased, observer, and so I can say with whatever whatever authority that carries.
Yeah, but when it comes to like mobile goddess wives and stuff like that, there's just like shock value to engage in like boundary maintenance between LDS and non-LDS. Okay, because I've been studying this for like a very long time, and you're much younger than I am. I'm 37. Still in your early 20s. But
Yeah.
like, even from like our different walks in life, we can actually smell the absolute BS what they're spewing. But like, say a normie Protestant, who's well-meaning, will actually think these people are like authorities, and unfortunately will accept basically what they're saying. So
This video, I believe, has about 87,000 people who have watched it.
87,000 people's IQs have been diminished because of it. Yeah.
And the Gospel for Mormons video, for example, has over 300,000 views.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that a lot of these ideas are getting passed around, because I hope that as we're talking about this, it's becoming clear that we have good reasons for disagreeing with how the Gospel for Mormons portrays our theology. And, as you go back and view the texts in their original context, I don't think that these two pastors are accurately representing what we believe, and I don't think they're accurately representing what the biblical texts state.
No, and here's the thing: like, if they were like very new people who were just like starting studying Mormonism, I could give them the benefit of the doubt. But at least when it comes to Why, who prides himself on how he's been in ministry officially since '83 and so forth, it's deception, and it's purposeful.
Here, we'll keep going. There's one other part here, then we'll pause and
go
we'll talk about that too.
And they teach that Jesus and Lucifer are brothers, spirit brothers, and so are we all.
Yep.
That's their teaching. Now, what I had pointed to, I think I quoted John 1 in the video. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. You can unpack John 1:1a, b, and c, and you can't get anything other than the eternal existence of Jesus Christ, that he is in ton theon, he is in an intimate relationship with the Father, but there's distinction, and he puts theos in the emphatic position, and c, essentially shouting that, and Jesus is by very nature God. He eternally existed. He was with the Father. He was God. He created all things. That's in John chapter 1. Now, the point he tries to make is that, well, it's not so far-fetched to think that Jesus and Lucifer are spirit offspring, and that Jesus is one God among many. I'd like to hear you speak to that just for a moment.
Well, what I saw in the article was a bunch of mismatched citations on completely different issues. He quotes Anthony Buzzard, a Socinian Unitarian, and throws out quotations from people as far away as Jimmy Dunn and everything else. And there's no evidence of an understanding of what the background of any of these citations actually is. There's no coherent attempt to be looking at John and saying, what was John actually trying to communicate? Instead, what you've got here is, I have my system, which is Mormonism, and I'm trying to find a way to keep John from being utterly contradictory to it. I need to find a way to give to the smaller and smaller number of believing Muslims who are looking to me for assurance. I need to give them a way around these texts. It's totally different when you're actually attempting to exegete a text and bring its meaning out than when you're trying to just find a way to make the text bland enough or unclear enough to not be contradictory to the system you're trying to promote. Those are two very different things.
Right.
And when you realize that and you start reading much of what's on the internet, very quickly you'll come to understand and be able to recognize when someone's actually trying to go, I want to know what John was communicating to his audience in his context, which is consistent throughout the book of John. And when someone is simply saying, well, in reality, what we've got here is we can't really know. We can't really put enough weight on this to say that it's contradicting what our system is already saying.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that in our modern day, the way that education is done for most people, they're not taught to think. That's called thinking critically. Mm-hmm. That's applying critical standards, and that's not common in the public educational system. It certainly needs to be much more common within Christian schools or Christian homeschooling. There needs to be an emphasis upon that kind of literary critical thought to where you're examining things in that way.
Right. You can say that I think that we have some examples in Scripture about how we can make it look like Jesus and Lucifer are brothers, and when you get to those texts, just no, absolutely not. But when you get to clear texts like John chapter 1 and Colossians chapter 1, there is just no way around the fact that the Bible teaches that Jesus is the creator of all things in the heavens and on earth, visible or invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers or authorities, all things.
Well, he would say that there is, and that you're being too fundamentalist and literalistic in your interpretation.
Right.
But to do that, he has to embrace the interpretive methodology of a Jimmy Dunn or of these other individuals.
That's right.
Who are not, again, they'll take an overarching concept and say, well, it's sort of like N.T. Wright does. You need to understand that the primary means through which we should be interpreting the New Testament and Paul's writings is the exile motif. And so everything has to fit that.
That's right.
Even if it ends up really making the text strain, everything has to fit that.
Right.
Well, Dunn's saying, well, this is the wisdom motif. And so it's not like it's not like Jesus' apostles actually, believe that he was the creator of all things. This is just sort of an analogy type thing. Well, the result of that is that the historical application of the book of Colossians, which was to a church that had the beginnings of proto-Gnosticism coming into it, the argument that Paul is offering against that becomes vapor. Mm-hmm. There's nothing left to it. And that's one of the real problems I have with Dunn and people like him is that the result is that the actual apostolic interaction in their days, in their time, just becomes worthless.
That's right.
It doesn't have any meaning anymore. That's what happens when you sort of get stuck in the ivory tower rather than being out and actually defending Christianity against world religions, which I think gives you the balance that sometimes the academy loses.
That's right.
But that's how they would respond to that. They'd be saying, oh, Jeff, you're being so simplistic and saying there's anything that's clear. Nothing is clear.
Yeah.
That's you have to adopt a real high level of skepticism, and that becomes an apologetic methodology.
Or the epistemological humility.
Oh, yes, we need to be epistologically. Yeah, right.
Yes, that's right.
So, longer clip. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry you had to sit through that. But
You're frozen.
They bring up two texts that I think he wanted to bring up. It was first, it was the John 1:1, and then you have Colossians 1.
Yeah.
So correct me. So he talks a little bit about how John consistently portrays God as being one with Jesus Christ. But just take a look at John 17.
Yeah, the oneness that John speaks about is the same type of oneness that Christ wants with the apostles. It's an interdwelling unity. It's not a consubstantial unity. And by the way, when it comes to John 1, I wasn't quoting liberals. I was discussing the grammar. I would actually suggest anyone, even if you're not LDS, to read what I said about John 1 and see that James is full of crap on this respect and the other topics he brings up here as well. By the way, we can discuss this later, but he says he kind of complains, say how a liberal would say, you're being too simplistic when it comes to interpretation. He's a reformed presuppositionalist. He would agree all interpretation is theory laden. So that kind of shows he's not exactly being totally honest, even with his own reformed presuppositionalist worldview and assumptions as well.
No, that's a good point. And there's actually, I love how he brings up Colossians 1 as well.
Which he doesn't interact with.
He doesn't interact with it. And it's important because you bring up Colossians 1 in several of your posts. And I actually really love your take on it, because you cite one scholar, if I remember correctly, talking about how Jesus Christ was the instrument of creation.
I think it's Nigel Turner, who himself was very conservative. He wasn't a liberal like James Dunn.
And that kind of terminology presupposes that Jesus Christ as a being is fundamentally distinct from God. So God is using Jesus Christ as the instrument of creation, which lines up decently well with LDS theology in that regard.
And as I showed, I was quoting another scholar, and this is partly wisdom Christology, although I believe Christ is not wisdom. He's greater than wisdom, but that's a different discussion for a different day. Colossians 1 seems to be harkening back to Psalm 32 in the Septuagint, where God creates through the word. But the word is also passive. And Christ is said to be the verbs of creation use of Christ as well in Colossians 1:15-20 are not actives, it's passives. Again, Christ is the instrumental agent of the Genesis creation.
Right.
And
The
because
passive
there's a
argument, I
nuance to the
remember.
Greek, there's like ongoing creation as well, but that's a different matter.
Yes, and that was what I was referring to. I'm sorry, you brought up a good point about bringing the passive it being like a passive object. That's what I was that's what I was referring to. Also, can we talk about how you kept on calling us Muslims?
Some in the
I
chat recognize that as well. Yeah.
I
Alhamdulillah.
it's happened a couple times now, but I don't realize that it happened repeatedly.
You know what? I've never actually noticed that until now, and I've seen like once or twice before. But yeah.
No, and I think it's probably because he's probably used to having this kind of discussion about Muslims, so he probably just flipped into default. But we don't approach the text as he would esteem a liberal would. We don't view we are trying to come at it as he said, or he was accusing us of not trying to, bring out what the original authors meant. In essence, he was talking about exegesis. And
which is what I was engaged in, and they never interacted with. So again, it's just projection on your end.
Yeah, and he criticizes us about thinking critically. One of the reason that Fair let me onto their platform is because I was willing to do a series on critical thinking for them.
And also, I think it's rich that a young earth creationist would actually accuse someone of being lacking in critical thinking skills. But that's
is he a young earth creationist?
Yes.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. But we're almost done, as we can see. We've got one more. We got one last clip. I said it was 18 before. I lied. It was 16. I'm
yeah,
very
16,
sorry about
and then
that.
we can offer say some concluding statements and see if people in the chat want to offer anything. But yeah, we can wrap up afterwards.
That sounds like an excellent idea. We'll go ahead and do that.
Sultan violent.
I think we can end on this.
Right.
It is so vitally important that you understand what they believe. Oftentimes you have to know it better than them.
These days, yeah.
These days, because they don't even understand sometimes what their own prophets and apostles have taught. So like we say, you have to convert them to Mormonism to convert them to Christ. Help them to understand what they believe. Now, if you go and interact with them and you haven't studied what they believe, if you haven't read the Book of Mormon, they may not have any respect for what you're doing. I mean, the first thing they ask me often is to say, have you read the Book of Mormon? Now, if I say, no, I'm not reading that. Like, that's like an atheist debating with me, and I say, well, have you ever read in my materials? Have you ever listened to a Christian debate an atheist? Have you ever tried to at least hear our side? And he's like, I'm not listening to that mythology. Right. I'd say, well, I know how serious you are about this.
Right.
So definitely engage with their material. I mean, if you love them, sacrifice for them. Sacrifice by learning.
Well, reading the Book of Mormon could be interpreted as a sacrifice at times.
I was going to say, I'm
well,
trying to say that.
Mark Twain,
yes.
What Mark Twain said, but seriously, if you don't have time, you don't want to read I've read the Book of Mormon many times, but if you, minimally, my suggestion has been to people, read 3rd Nephi, because that's there's a couple other places you can look it up, but read the section about Jesus coming to the Americas. So at least you can say, well, I haven't read all of it, but, I did read the part about Jesus, and it raised some really interesting questions, and that allows you to get to the subject of Jesus by contrasting. Now, what Joseph Smith believed about Jesus when he wrote the Book of Mormon and what he believed when he died, two very different things.
That's right.
Huge amount of evolution in between, but still it can give you a way to get into the important things, because as I've always said in Witnessing Mormons, who is God? Who is Christ? What is salvation? Those are the issues you need to get to. Everything else is an off-ramp and an on-ramp to get back to that particular
That's right.
subject.
All right. And that's it.
Okay, let me just say, he brings up, the evolution of Joseph Smith's Christology. If you're familiar with Wright, that's like a dog whistle to he believes Joseph was initially a modalist. This comes out on all these presentations. So I would suggest the interview, which is on my YouTube channel, I did with Stephen Murphy, Early Mormon Modalism, ? Or the 2-part debate I did with Adam Stokes on this about a year ago. And by the way, myself and Adam will be debating the Greek New Testament and whether it teaches modalism later this year. We'll be saying up later this year, once I get back from a conference in June. So yeah, White engages in the eisegesis of the Book of Mormon, and the whole contrasting Christ and 3rd Nephi, I think that may be the whole Christ coming in judgment after the destruction. But my dude, read the Apocalypse. Once Christ comes back at the eschaton, even in these post-millennial eschatology, he'll be wrathful. That's why it speaks of the orge, or the wrath of the Lamb, in the Book of Revelation. And White would agree. the depiction of deity in the Old Testament is the same in the New Testament. It's not, say, a wrathful God in the Old and a sugary, nice guy in the New. They're both loving and yet wrathful as well. So again, he didn't really go into it, so I don't want to like dwell too much. But if that's how he's going in terms of, say, the contrast of Christ in the Book of Mormon, at least with respect to Tur Nephi and his appearance in the New World, it's not good. And it's rich that he says like be familiar with the sources. Get Blake Oster's works on theology and some other good works that have come out in like say the last couple of decades that I know for a fact he has never interacted with or read, or the works of Brent Garner or Jerry Grover, or like websites like My Own or Fair and stuff like that that have actually good sources and references as well. And of course the B.H. Roberts Foundation, because my boss will fire me if I don't say that. Or
now, at this point, there are a couple. You make some excellent points, and I was looking at a couple of the chats here as you were talking. I find it telling that, let's see, who was the one that was saying that? It was Ellie Marie, who talks a little bit about how James White encourages to definitely read the Book of Mormon, and then proceeds to mock it, and it's telling about at least a little bit for me that he doesn't take this very seriously.
I mean, like, White would say, like, if you're studying Islam, and I've listened to some of his stuff in Islam, you don't start mocking Muhammad or the Quran straight away. You can say, like, you don't believe it's inspired, but, like, you try to be as respectful as possible while still being assertive, if you will. And that's, I think, the better approach to take. But yeah, it's just like a real dick move to, like, what he just did. But yeah, I'll let you finish what you were saying.
No, and that's one thing that concerns me. When I see people start to do that, I start to question whether or not they're actually willing to engage in good faith. He talked a little bit about Third Nephi, but one of the things he doesn't really bring up is that unlike the Bible, and our friend Travis talks about this often, where the Book of Mormon is an actual book, where the stuff that happens before Third Nephi affects how we read Third Nephi. So he was talking a little bit about modalism, or accusing Joseph Smith of modalism. There are texts in the Book of Mormon, such as Mosiah 14 and 15, where if you read them carefully, they reject this idea of modalism or fundamental Trinitarianism. And that's even something like Dan Vogel, who's a very vocal critic. He doesn't hold to the same idea that Joseph Smith's modalism as many of these other critics do, is my understanding.
Yeah, I actually asked Adam Stokes, who himself is a modalist, if Dan Vogel understands modalism. He said, lol, no. But even if you read Mosiah 15, I know that's one of the texts White appeals to. There's actually a numerical distinction of person in that chapter, like the Son intercedes before the Father. And once you understand, like, it's a prophetic expansion, if you will, of Mosiah 14, which is Isaiah 53. Again, there's numerical distinction of person in that chapter as well between the servant of Yahweh and Yahweh himself and so forth. Again, I discussed this in my interview with Stephen Murphy, but also my debate with Adam Stokes, where I also go through the 1832 First Vision account, the lectures in faith in general, and particularly lecture in Faith 5, and a host of other issues that come up as well. So.
Yeah. And so that's an important thing. So his claim that Joseph Smith's views are evolving over time, I think, is exaggerated at best and misleading at worst.
Yeah, by the way, he's actually LDS, but he has the name Anti-Mormon. I have a question for Byron. Sorry about my name, I'm LDS, but what I can't get my head wrapped around is that what is Durban's and White's argument? Because they keep ranting, I'm guessing, on different things. Yeah, that's the thing, like, it's all over the place. They accuse me of being, like, all over the place, my article, but I think it's projection. And he also asked, and by the way, thanks for the super chat, dude. Can you debate Durban or White? And here's the thing. I will happily debate James White in a public moderated debate on Sola Scriptura and baptism regeneration. It's not going to happen, but if anyone can make it happen, I will happily debate White on those two topics, because he's never debated Sola Scriptura with a Latter-day Saint. He's never debated baptism regeneration, ever. And they both have ramifications. So I'd be willing to debate those topics. Or the thesis was Joseph Smith a modalist in early Mormonism. I'll happily debate him on that particular point as well. So, yes, that's one he always brings up.
I'm certain you would do a spectacular job in that regard.
Because I'm actually familiar with sources he's not.
I mean, I've read your books on those subjects, and that's an important thing. I don't think he fully addresses either. And we've listened to James White, for example, cite proof texts such as 1 Corinthians 4:8 to support Sola Scriptura, but that's something that you very clearly address in your book.
No, to be fair, it's First Corinthians 4:6. I think
Oh,
Jeff
I'm
Durbin
sorry, my
has
mistake.
to
I'm
be fair, I
sorry.
don't think White has ever done that, but I know Jeff Durbin has in a few sermons.
Oh, I could be misremembering that. That's
Yeah.
very
No,
likely.
the main go-to text for James White for Sola Scriptura would be 2 Timothy 3:16-17, but he would also bring up the denunciation of the Corban rule in Matthew 15:7, and a host of other issues like how graphe or scripture is said to be theopneustos, and no other source is said to be theopneustos, and so forth. So, yeah, but yeah, it's fine. It happens.
Yeah, and I the only times I've seen recently, the last interaction I've seen him, James White, and Jeff Durbin do with a believing member was their discussion with Kwaku,
Yeah.
and that was like a live interview, and Kwaku did all right.
Yeah, I mean, like there were some problems like late Steve Hayes of Triablog, and even Sam Shamoon, who's no friend of Mormonism,
Right.
said that White and Durbin did not do a good job in that debate. And I was pleasantly surprised by Kwaku. I thought he actually held his own. And he kind of went, because Kwaku does not understand Reformed theology, how he presents Calvinism is a bit of a caricature. So like it didn't really do well for him on that respect. But be that as it may, like he held his own, and it kind of showed like White and Durbin, if you can't like interact like say someone who at that time is just basically a comedian by profession, you know, and a bit of an influencer, even by his own admission, not a theologian. Good luck if you want to debate me or Blake Oster or someone else. You know, but as I said, I will happily debate James White on Sola Scriptura, Baptism and Regeneration, or even was Joseph Smith a modalist when he wrote the Book of Mormon and produced the 1832 First Version account? You know, or whatever limits he wants to, like, say the time range to that, because he keeps bringing it up and it's frankly bogus. So, yeah.
And what that kind of prompts additional questions. So, for example, I've been asked a couple times if someone was to reach out to me, because I've done a couple of responses to certain critics of the church. For example, Bill Reel, I did that with you, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was great.
I mean, if James White and Jeff Durbin want to reach out to me, I mean, I guess they can. I just don't know what it would prove. Like, congratulations. Even if you were to beat me, all you could prove is that you could beat a 23-year-old. Way to really stick it to the church. That sort of thing. I pull a lot of my information from you, and because you're a valid resource, and I don't think that there are caricatures of your intent and your exegesis really measure up and hold up under the burden of scrutiny, because you're very well informed. That's been my view, and I am happy to cite you. I'm happy to cite you and your arguments. And if someone wants to challenge that, I would recommend that they go to you instead of acting through some kind of intermediary such as myself, because I mean, I know a little bit, but really what they should be doing is they should be willing to talk to the Blake Oslers. They should be willing to talk to the Stephen Smiths. They should be willing to talk to people like you about these topics, because you would be able to represent your points of view better than I could.
And also, I'm pretty well read in Reformed theology, so I know a lot of the presuppositions coming into the play already. So
all the more reason.
Yeah.
And actually, I do have to get going here pretty soon. But
no, that's fine. No, that's
well, let's go through chats. Are there any chats?
Yeah. Okay. Well, because he has to leave, if anyone wants to like leave any final chat in like say the next 2 or 3 minutes, let's be the case. If not, we'll just end. But yeah. Well, I'll wait for that. Thanks for coming on. This was fun. So
oh, it's a lot of fun, and I hope that the clips I was able to pick out were useful in terms of
they were. I think they were pretty good. By the way, for those who would like for me to review either my blog or this podcast/YouTube channel a particular video or particular article, you can do so, preferably if you were to like say Venmo me something, because it does take time to like out of my schedule and so forth. Not to dox too much personal information, but as Zach and a couple others know, things are happening in my personal life as well, which would be requiring more and more of my time. You know what's happening, but be that as it may, yeah, so I'll consider it. But yeah, anti-Mormon, have you guys seen Ward Radio with Hanson and Isabel? React to that. I would want your opinions on it. Good review. Yeah, I might do it, but the TLDR is like Hanson dealt with history. He did a very good job at showing the documentary evidence, and Isabel engaged in semantic obfuscation. So, you know, I'm biased. I do consider Jacob Hansen a friend, although that's kind of a contentious pint in some circles these days. But I thought overall he did a good job. And there's a very good. I'm not a fan of signature books, but like their most recent series of essays, Secret Covenants. Apart from like having two excellent articles on Fanny Alger, there's an article by Mark Tensmeyer absolutely obliterating the idea that Joseph Smith was never polygamist. And also my friend Jacob Vedrini, who was on my last podcast episode, who's a fundamentalist himself. He has a very good website. I think it's called Debunking Polygamy Denials or something like that. But if you kind of go to the show notes of that podcast episode, I'd link to his website. And it's a very good resource as well. Isabel et al., they're nuts when it comes to denying polygamy. You know.
No, and I appreciate what Jacob Hansen tries to do. I've interacted with him a couple of times. I've tried to. There are a couple of points on which he could attest that I've tried to critique him, but all in all, I can appreciate Jacob's intent and I can appreciate his desire to engage with people in debates, which is something that can be a little bit scary, and I can respect that. I guess the only thing I would recommend is continue to get a variety of different opinions from a variety of different scholars. Everyone has their own kind of niches. And, for instance, Robert mentioned here his specialties on Catholicism, Reformed theology, and understanding that. We've referred to a couple of other people whose specialties are different, such as Stephen Smoot, who's like Book of Abraham specialty and like old world languages. And so everyone has kind of their own unique study and their own unique specialty. And I'm privileged to be able to be friends with several people who, despite their differences in study, can all agree that the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints is a spiritually and intellectually fulfilling faith to hold to. And I guess like I said, I'm running a little short on time here, but if people want to reach out to me, they can reach out to me at my email. That's zwright@fairlatterdaysaints.org. I'm usually pretty good about responding to direct messages on Facebook as well. While I certainly am not I never once claimed omniscience. I am happy to help with people who have questions or want to be able to engage with these topics a little bit more deeply. I think it would be good and beneficial for me as I discuss this sort of thing, and I will refer people to the scholars that I think would be helpful in that regard. And at the end of the day, I hope we all can just agree that regardless of where we net out in terms of the scholarship, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a really, really great place to be. It is the true and living church contra what James White has insisted members of the church are trying to push away from. I really do believe this stuff, and I'm willing to help people get to that point too. It's worked for me. I want to be able to help other people too. So that's that. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Oh, no, perfect. Well, thanks for that. And I'll let you leave. But for those in the comment section, I just shared a link to Brian Hill's article on the polygamy denials of Joseph Smith, because someone did bring up, like, well, if you believe he was a polygamist, you have to accuse or impute to him deception, which I don't believe the case. But I think Brian Hill's article, which is on his website, is a very good resource on that. So that's something that came up during the debate as well. But Zach, thanks for coming on. Hopefully we'll have you on in the near future.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate you thinking about me. And if there's something else that we want to collab in the future, just let me know.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, and thanks for everyone who participated in the live stream. So we'll end, but hopefully we'll have a podcast episode in June. The Mormon History Association will be held the 13th to the 16th. I will be there. I'll also be at the Fair Conference in August, and I think you'll be at the Fair Conference as well.
I will,
so,
yes.
So definitely get your tickets for that, especially the Fair Conference, and come up and say hi, and buy me a book at the bookstore if you want as well. So thanks for participating, everyone, and yeah, hopefully we'll be on and doing a live stream again in the near future. So until then, thanks again, Zach, and have a great week ahead.
You too. Have a